Alright, so this is my final exam. The first question, on Sunday, December 4th, we had our first lasting snow in West Michigan. How did this snow event relate or not relate to the article you read by Harmon? Is typical November snow in West Michigan of greater intensity than late in January? Why or why not? What is the impact of Lake Michigan water temperatures on winter snow in West Michigan? The snowfall would support the findings. They had discovered that the lower half of the state often started seeing snowfall in December, when the northern half had already been exposed to it for a much longer period of time. Is it typically November snow in West Michigan of greater intensity than in late January? Why or why not? Typically, November snow in West Michigan is of greater intensity. Storms in the early months come from the west closer to the Rockies and gradually shifts to a southern starting point. Southern point leads to less storms and less intense storms hitting West Michigan. What is the impact of Lake Michigan water temperatures on winter snow in West Michigan? As storms move over the warmer waters of Lake Michigan, the air becomes warmer and absorbs more moisture. When the dense warmer air hits the coast of Michigan, it becomes too cool. It begins to cool again from the cooler ground and causes a heavy snowfall since the storm began over warmer waters. If the storm would have started over land, it would have been a lesser snowfall. But what decade were the population distribution settlement patterns in Michigan determined and why? Since this decade, these patterns have not changed much. So I have by 1860, most of the good areas of the state have been settled. Settlement patterns that we see during the late 1800s are the same settlement patterns that we currently have in Michigan. Most of the lower half of the lower peninsula has been settled with relatively low settling and population distribution in the northern half of the lower peninsula. Throughout the upper peninsula, by 1860, parts along Lake Michigan coast had been settled, but the population distribution remained stronger from about Muskegon down to the border and from about Muskegon directly eastward into Bay County. As stated in the presentation during week 7, when talking about the human geography, it is the same pattern we see today and is noticeable. If you drive throughout southern Michigan, you will see more population density than driving north in Mount Pleasant due to the settlement, the land we have down here, the industrial capabilities that kept many in the areas. So, for example, the furniture industry kept many in this area, and Detroit's industry kept many in that area during the 1800s. But the main reason we have large areas of land mostly unsettled and even today largely unsettled was due to the history of the land. Early on, it was Indian territory and considered lesser land and largely not able to be settled. And that's the areas around like Oscoda, Alpena, like the northern lower peninsula, which is still pretty rural. Question 3. In what sequence was Michigan by type of tree lumbered and why? What was the short-term and long-term impact of the removal of Michigan's trees? Was there a major impact difference between the upper and lower peninsula? So initially, lumbering in Michigan began by the French, who were building forts, fur trading posts, and missions in Michigan. Eventually, as time progressed, British powers and eventually the United States would use the large sources of hardwoods in Michigan to produce ships for war and merchant needs. The first major tree to be logged extensively in Michigan was the white pine. Around 1855, it was heavily logged until 1895 in the lower peninsula and until the early 1900s in the upper peninsula. When white pine logging was complete, the attention of the logging industry turned to the hemlock and hardwood species of trees. The white pine was logged first due to its size. It had a wide diameter and grew to be very tall. It also had a lot of branches that could be used for other wood products. It was an ideal tree to produce mass and construction lumber due to the straightness of the tree. White pine in the UP was virtually wiped out and has not yet reestablished. Of all the watersheds that supported the lumber industry in Michigan, the Muskegon watershed was the most productive, with almost 55 billion board feet supplied between 1834 and 1897. The lower peninsula provided massive amounts of lumber, close to 135 billion board feet, versus the UP only providing 24.5 billion board feet. The heavy lumbering of the lower peninsula wiped out many of the natural forests that were in Michigan. Today we have low amounts of old-growth forests due to the lumber industry. Lumbering was not environmentally conscious. The fire of 1871 that burned Holland was able to travel across Michigan due to the dense underbrush that was exposed from the intense deforestation that took place in the area. The massive deforestation also caused many areas to experience massive soil erosion. Clare County lost large amounts of soil from wind erosion since trees were no longer covering that area. The Kingston Plain was so heavily deforested that it was burned so hot by a fire that it was never able to fully regrow. Even to this day, it's still not fully regrown. The heavy logging boom caused many to build new cities in Michigan that thrived during the heavy logging days. But once the industry faded out, the cities themselves died from loss of production, leaving many ghost towns scattered across Michigan. The logging moved north as the search for larger trees continued, since the lower peninsula was beginning to have less due to massive deforestation. So really, the lower peninsula was logged more intensively than the northern peninsula. Uh, Order of the harvest was the white pine was harvested first, and then the attention was focused more towards the hardwoods in the southern Michigan and then the mixed forest in the UP. And they focused on lumbering in the UP by 1890. Which bulk committed Question number 4: which bulk commodities shipped on the Great Lakes are synergistic in that they are related and lead to a single product? What is the role of the siloxane in this synergy, and does it have a temporal limitations? The bulk commodities that were shipped on the Great Lakes and are synergistic in that they will lead to a single product are coal, iron ore, and limestone in order to produce steel. The steel was essential for the railroad industry in the 1800s and even become essential for the automotive industry in the later 1900s. All three of these were consumed in large quantities, which required the use of the Great Lakes in order to keep up with the demand. Ships were the only mode of transportation that were able to constantly supply the mills in order to keep up with the demand for steel. The Sioux Locks were important from taking materials from the states that bordered Lake Superior, so Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The materials were shipped through the locks and then taken to ports along Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. The Sioux Locks helped to expedite the travel time for the materials. From these areas, they would have moved out across the Midwest to support the steel industry and eventually the railroad industry. And now the Sioux Locks are kind of irrelevant since we do have the railroad industry across the U.S. Question number 5: how, if any, has economic potential of Lake County changed since the 1950s? Were there events in the past or recently added events that made a difference? So what I have is Lake County's population has been dropping since the decline of the lumber industry. As the industry began to grow smaller and smaller, more people abandoned the land. The land was heavily damaged due to the large loss of trees in the area. This caused massive damage to the surrounding environment. The federal government now owns 50% of land in the county due to nobody wanting to move to it. The area became known as the Manistee National Park in 1945. Federal preservation areas do not create revenue for the county. As the county still loses population creating open land, the federal and state governments continue to buy it for the parks. This causes more and more revenue to be lost for the local government, and it's kind of still a process that's going to continue for a long time, as the county still loses money to support people in its county, and then people are going to be leaving due to loss of industry since 50% of the land is owned by the government. Question 6, focusing on the LQ, juvenile crime, lung cancers, income, teenage pregnancy, and concealed pistol permits, and what you learned this semester. Discuss the common spatial denominator variable that behind these distribution patterns in the upper part of the lower peninsula in Michigan. Reviewing the videos by Hill, Beauregard, Kolb, Lucier, Lyle, Rick, Croft, and Manny, it showed various outcomes on the topics they chose dealing with the northern lower peninsula. The northern part of the lower peninsula had the lowest income rates of the lower peninsula. This is important since lower income tends to lead to higher crime, which was actually proven in Manny's video on CPLs and violent crime rates. 7 of the highest rated violent crime counties were in the northern lower peninsula. These areas also had the highest CPL carriers along with the UP, but what is interesting with this is the fact is that the divorce rates in the northern lower peninsula were lower than other areas of Michigan, except Traverse City County, which is a big tourism county and area and has a higher income, which was the outlier. Although these areas had higher violent crime, the juvenile crime rates were lower than other areas of Michigan. This means that the crimes were being committed by adults 18 or older. Other data about the northern lower peninsula that was taken from the videos is that the northern lower peninsula had slightly higher rates of uninsured drivers, and that teen pregnancy has a slight pattern in the northern lower peninsula. What is contributing to these factors? The northern lower peninsula is a more rural area of Michigan. Jobs in the area tend to be low paying compared to the rest of the state. With a lack of sufficient income and lack of higher education, the areas tend to be stuck in a trend that can be seen across the United States and other counties that are the same. Heavy industry and well-paying jobs throughout the history of Michigan tend to remain in the flatter areas in the southern Michigan. Although some did spread to the northern lower peninsula, it was never to the effect of GM in southern Michigan and around Detroit. Since the jobs are low paying, most of the highest education in these areas are high school diplomas and GEDs. And that is my final exam.